Welcome to Why Politics Matters here on Salam Radio 106.2 FM. Thank you so much for joining us again after a 1 week break. I needed a bit of downtime, Alex.
There was a lot going on, wasn't there?
There was a lot going on, and I thought I'd take a week off. So apologies to our regular listeners for not being on air last week. We will try and be better, but obviously we've got a break coming up for Christmas as well, haven't we?
Little Christmas break, where we shall start putting together some more promotional things and start making a little bit more of a buzz and seeking some more of your interactions going forward.
And that's the biggest thing for me is listener interaction, because the purpose for doing this show is to get people thinking about the world in which they live, how it operates, how it runs, and how things could possibly change. My name's Imtiaz Ali. I'm here with Alex Blower, and we are here doing Why Politics Matters. Today, we are going to be talking about, I think, a fairly hot topic, especially recently.
It's quite contemporary right now, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, for me and you, it probably never went away, but it's something that I feel like has been lying dormant in the political discussion for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years maybe.
I'd go further back, maybe 40, Thatcher.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Possibly,
yeah. But the main premise of tonight's show is discussing privatisation and nationalisation.
Right, okay. So good topic, big topic.
Yeah.
We can set the scene, or maybe you can set the scene while I share some of these links on the Facebook, because we are live on Facebook, and we are also hoping to take your calls on 01733602133. If anybody wants to contribute to the show, you can call in 01733602133. And like I said, we are live on Facebook, so do get your comments in. So, Alex, tell us, what is nationalisation or privatisation? Can you describe one without describing the other?
Well, let's start with nationalisation, which is basically the government take control of an industry which was previously owned by private firms. So the nationalisation is taking something that is currently in the corporate domain and bringing it into the public domain.
So I was just going to interrupt there. So something that's being currently run by people who are in the business of making money.
Yeah, and for that purpose.
And for the purpose of making money. And that's taken over. So it's like like an acquisition by the government in order to do exactly the same thing that the company's already doing, but taking the profits for themselves.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, privatisation is pretty much the opposite. And what that is, it is taking an entity in society or an industry which is already publicly owned.
Okay.
Or already nationalised. And turning it over to corporations to run for a profit.
Who would do that? That sounds
crazy.
crazy.
Seems rather bizarre, doesn't it? But, and this is why I went right back to Thatcher, some of the industries that people might not be aware of are some of the entities that we have in our current landscape that were once owned by you, our listeners, our taxpayers, include the likes of Rolls-Royce.
Whoa. Hang on. Rolls-Royce.
Rolls-Royce, yes.
Used to be owned by me.
Yeah,
well, maybe not me, maybe mom and dad.
Yeah, your great-granddad.
Yeah.
That was once a
not my
publicly
great-granddad, because he was nowhere near the UK.
Was he not?
Yeah, he was.
That
was
doesn't mean that he didn't have a little bit in it, maybe.
Yeah, my great-granddad was actually India before pre-partition.
Right.
but maybe my dad. Okay, maybe my dad. Go on.
What else have we got? British Telecom.
So does the name give it away? British Telecom. Because I'm thinking
Telecom,
British Airways.
Yeah. British Airways was another one which I would have got to. British Airways was actually publicly owned as well.
We've had a comment in already from Faisal Mahmood saying, "Is this a bit like what Peterborough City Council did with the bin collection? They took it from Amy." A little bit, yeah. We'll talk about that, Faisal. So that's like outsourcing versus delivering the service. So you got
in-house, and it was originally, wasn't it?
It was originally a Peterborough City Council, and then it went out to Amy, and now it's gone out to Aragon. That's it, yeah. So it's still being outsourced. People are still doing that service for a profit and charging the council, who are obviously taking our money through council tax and business rates, and paying for it. So yeah, it is a little bit like that, Faisal. We will come on to it at a more granular level and at a local council, but right now we're talking national politics. So go on, British Airways.
Yep, British Airways, British Telecom.
Okay.
What else would we have? Rolls-Royce.
Rolls-Royce.
Your national electric infrastructure.
What about British Railways? There was a company called British Railways, wasn't it?
All of our railways were run by British Rail.
Okay.
And of course,
British Rail even, sorry, yeah.
And this is an interesting one because, of course, the idea of, or the story we were sold to privatise with them was that it would make it more competitive for rail travellers.
Okay.
That there would be many operators on the same railway competing for customers. But, of course, that's not the case. If you get a train, you're getting a train to get to work, to commute. You need to be somewhere. There's a reason for you getting on that train.
Yeah, sure.
And what you have essentially is still a monopoly of the railways. If you're travelling on Peterborough, chances are you're travelling on one or two railways who offer pretty much the same rough prices.
Yeah, so you know, like how if you wanted to take a taxi from A to B,
yeah,
you got the road infrastructure, but the actual vehicle can go on any one of those roads.
Of course.
And there's probably 10 different routes. And then there's 10 different pricing structures. So you could potentially say, okay, fair enough, I can choose which. And then customer service is a big part of it as well. You quite like your taxi driver, or you quite like this company, whatever it is. Yeah?
One might take the fastest route, one might know the back roads.
Yeah, one might have a really
yeah.
comfortable car, one might have a really nice playlist while you're on your journey.
But of course, with trains, that's not the case.
The trains,
you're on the same track, aren't you?
You're on a seat,
yep.
You're on a track. There's not 8 different routes from here to London. There's one.
No.
There's literally one route from here to London. It just goes straight down, you know, and you might have maybe 2 different railway tracks that go, but that's for trains coming in the opposite direction, right? So there's not multiple tracks. So it doesn't seem like an area where you'd have a natural natural competition.
Unless they were going to build a competing infrastructure.
Right, which is stupid.
Of course it is.
It's absolutely crazy.
And this seems to be the run-of-the-mill narrative across a lot of these industries that were privatised, that were previously public-owned. I mean, water is another one. Apparently, water was privatised again to make it more competitive. But of course...
So Anglian Water's a company owned by shareholders, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the water company here in in Peterborough. There's obviously lots of different companies up and down the country. But yeah, pipes... taking your sewage away and pipes feeding into your water meters, feeding the water that's coming through your taps. There's only one set of pipes. It makes no sense for every home to have 5 different sets of pipes and for you to choose who provides your water.
No, if
the
you live in
Anglia,
you can't buy your water from Southern Water or Thames Water because they have no infrastructure in this area.
Right. Okay. Before we go on to the pros and cons, because I think we've probably, assigned our colours quite early doors.
It might be obvious to the listeners, maybe.
But let's turn it around a little bit. Let's offer a little bit of fairness in this discussion. One of the biggest gripes that I hear about nationalisation, or the reason for privatisation, is efficiencies. Okay, there's so many anecdotes of people working in council buildings or council-run operations where they'll do 1 day's worth of work in 5 days.
Sure.
They'll be off sick for 2 weeks. They're accumulating a pension at a ridiculous rate. It's not fair on you working in the private sector. It's not fair on me working in the private sector. These people are just milking it. Is what people say. So aren't nationalised industries just a mass expanse of waste and inefficiency?
I've heard the argument. Yeah.
You've heard the argument. Now, what do you think about that?
Well, let's have a look at what efficiency is, and especially when we're talking about money. Surely it means your money being used the best it possibly can. Well, let's stick with water, for example. Well, water, you've got all this money being taken out of it for shareholders. Since the water industry was actually nationalised, there's not been a single water reservoir built in the UK. Now, of course, the demands upon the water have increased.
Yeah, sure.
But the resource to provide that has not. So what's happened is that our levels and quality of water has died over the years. It's gone down. We now dump... We spoke about this an awful lot on our last show, but human waste into our rivers. And these are cost reduction operations to get shareholders the best possible profits. Now, let's turn that on itself. And if it was actually nationalised, every single one of those shareholder profits could have been going into upgrading the infrastructure, to stopping human waste going into our rivers and building reservoirs to meet the growing needs.
Okay, so let me see if I understand your argument. You're saying there might have been waste, there might have been inefficiencies.
I'm sure there was, and I would not argue that
you
there
wouldn't
wasn't.
argue against it, right? But those wastages and inefficiencies, either they haven't been eliminated or they have been eliminated by the private companies, which means they're making a bigger profit, but that doesn't translate to a better level of service.
Oh, I would argue that there is even more waste now, but instead it's being taken by the shareholders, because every single pound
profits are waste.
Of course they are, and when there's only
you're so left wing.
I know,
you're
right?
So left wing.
But if there's only now, I mean, I wouldn't say all profits are waste, but when there's a core industry that is single purpose,
okay,
and cannot be competed against, so water.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's no competition, so there's no reason for it to be privatised.
It's a real shame that this is a two-way conversation. I'd love to have a third person in here
who
representing the other
side,
because I don't want to challenge you, because I agree with a lot of what you're saying. But let me just read out a few comments, and maybe we've got some differing views.
I hope so.
Faisal Mahmood, I'm sure he's going to have some different views because
he likes to play devil's advocate as well.
Not just that, but I think he does somewhat support privatization to an extent, I think, from previous conversations.
Well, what's
Faisal,
he got to say?
Correct me if I'm wrong. A few comments before Faisal, though. Mike's said Rolls-Royce was nationalized by the Conservative government. He said Tory government. I'll say Conservative. Believe it or not, I didn't know this. I'm sure you meant 1970 something, to save it from bankruptcy, to save aero engine manufacturing. So
right.
Rolls-Royce produce engines for cars, produce beautiful cars. That's what everybody knows. But they also produce engines for airliners, passenger airliners,
and military aircraft as well.
Also, and specifically, the most important thing, they produce engines for military aircraft that the British use. So the RAF are dependent on them. So that sounds like a crazy thing to be privatizing. Your own national defense, like regardless of how you feel about the military.
Sure.
But if you've got national defense and you privatize a company that's making engines for fighter jets, and then that company can sell to anyone in the world,
and people can invest in it to take a profit out of it as well.
Yeah, profit from death.
Yeah.
Firstly, profit from death, and that's the ethical side, but also just the would you want to privatize as an unscrupulous government who wants to protect its borders?
Yeah.
Would you want to privatize an industry that's got such a specialist knowledge of fighter jet engines?
You'd think you'd want to keep it in-house, wouldn't you?
Yeah. So that's an interesting one. Really good point, Mike. Thank you for that. 70% of the British water industry is owned abroad, Mike says. I will come on to that. I'm going to make a note of that. So
this
foreign
is
investment.
And I wasn't aware of that. So thanks, Mike. I'm familiar, however, that some of our nationalised railways are run by other countries to increase their GDP and to subsidise the prices for their travellers.
Yeah, so I've heard somebody say the rail industry is nationalised, just not by the UK government.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's the French and the Germans and the Dutch.
So essentially, when you actually pay for a train journey, you're not just paying for your train journey.
You're trading for you're paying for French train journeys and German train journeys.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Faisal Mahmood says there are 3 options to get to London: LNER, Thames Network, and the other one I can't remember the name of. Yeah, so LNER and the City Thames Link and the Great North
and that's
Eastern.
3 options running through the day. Okay, but let's say you're travelling first thing in the morning. You're leaving at 8 o'clock. You've got to be there at 10 o'clock. How many options do you have within your window? And that's really what I mean. It's still running on that same network. It's still running on that infrastructure, and it's a service born upon the demand of its users.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike says, I worked for Rolls-Royce Aero in the 70s. We were the most productive large factory in Coventry. Faisal says, this is it. Faisal says, I agree, water, gas and electric should be nationalised. It's immoral and un-Islamic to profit from natural resources.
Right, yeah.
So that's an interesting one. So the morality of profiting, we can talk about that.
So, and Faisal, if you're still listening, how does that also expand into, let's say, private education versus public education? And also
medicine
and the health service as well, NHS, and maybe also in a more modern society, communications and the internet.
Yeah. Good questions. Okay, so let's get back to it then. So, what are we saying? Okay, foreign investment. But before we do that, I just want to get a full list. So we've talked about water.
Yep.
And we've talked about electricity. And we've talked about railways. And obviously we've talked about Rolls-Royce.
And we've mentioned the communications as well, haven't we, BT?
We could
probably speak about that a little
comms.
bit more, because I feel that's something that's actually becoming more and more important, isn't it?
So, communications. Is there a national good to be served by everyone being connected?
And I would always argue, yes, of course.
Not even argue, like it's an absolute given,
It needs
right?
to be, doesn't it? Yeah.
Would you say, given the country that we live in, it's everyone's basic right to have access to the internet, to a telephone, to just to be able to communicate, just to be able to get signals from the rest of the country and the rest of the world?
It's one of the indicators of poverty is the ability to take part in your national culture,
Excellent
in
point.
things which are happening.
Yeah.
And through connection, we also build up social capital, our network, and our ability to therefore navigate other experiences.
Yeah.
You know, the more people we know, the more advice we can call on. So fundamentally, it is important for us all to have access to communication networks. And even more so, more and more we're reliant upon these networks to be able to run our everyday life. You cannot apply for a bank account nowadays, hardly, without going online. Or if you do, without the access to the internet, your choices are limited.
So this is this is where I want to come in with the phrase first world problems.
Sure.
And it's an interesting, I mean, there's a bit of a joke, first world problems, like the button on my car window doesn't automatically wind the window down. It's like first world problems. But you've got people in different parts of the world who don't have electricity.
Sure.
So can we say electricity is a basic human need?
In our society,
Yep.
if you need electricity to take part in our society, then of course it is, yeah. And this is the thing, isn't it? I mean, just going, and what you've cottoned onto is the point that I made about poverty, isn't it?
Yes.
And about being able to interact with the other things which are happening around you. So in an area where people haven't got electricity, if 50% of the people around you haven't got electricity, you're not actually that poor,
Then
are
you're
you?
not isolated within the community in which you live.
Correct.
Right. So it's the community in which you live is the point, the reference point. So it's relative poverty.
For abject
rather
poverty,
than,
yeah.
the absolute poverty.
And for the perception thereof.
So the absolute poverty level, I think, has been defined as something like $2 a day or something worldwide. And that takes into account, obviously not developed Western countries, because, you know, people are on 10, 15, even £20,000 a year and living in poverty, versus people, you know, you have somebody in, say, Pakistan, I'm from Pakistan, someone in Pakistan who's on £1,000 a year and living relatively comfortably.
Sure.
So the absolute level is not necessarily relevant. What we're talking about here is what is an absolute basic human need for you to be out of poverty within your own environment. So UK specific, you would say absolutely water, that's universal.
Gotcha.
Absolutely electricity, that's pretty much universal in this country. Gas, pretty much 100%. Like,
energy.
Yeah, energy, any kind of energy resource, yeah. Communications, which you talked about, connection.
I would argue yes. I mean, I understand that there's going to be arguments against that, but for me, yeah, I feel so. And especially when you're looking at the future, aren't you, as well? Not just today. And it's what life we want other people to have that are coming behind us, and our children definitely need this access.
Yeah. See, I would say with communications, I would say that's even more imperative than the railways. Because the railways...
I'd agree.
In a way, I mean, I've travelled to London and worked in London, and there's lots and lots of people on very, very good salaries who are going to London because there's the railway service there, and they're paying the £6,000, £7,000, £8,000 a year. But I would say 95% of the population of Peterborough don't need the railways, other than the odd occasional weekend away where they want to go to, you know, York or London or whatever it is, Liverpool. So I would say communications is even more vital. That's not to say I don't agree that the railways should be nationalised, but I would say communications is far higher up that list.
And surely it must have an impact on people going into work as well.
Yeah.
In the modern age, with so many less people working in offices and able to take up tasks from a home desktop office.
Yeah. Does that strengthen the need to privatise railways or weaken it a little bit? Because you've got more of a choice.
I don't see how it falls into it.
Okay.
Again, the railways are user defined on what the demand is.
Yes.
So in other words, and this goes back to the need for them to be nationalised, because that way, when the user need is not there, you simply cut back on service.
Yeah. Completely agree with that. There's a side conversation going on, which I love to see, between Faisal and Mike.
Oh, brilliant.
Got to follow this a little bit. But Faisal, I think, is, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I feel like he's making a case for nationalisation of infrastructure, but retaining privatisation of service. So, and I feel like I'm getting that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Faisal, but So, for example, we've got the British rail network that connects cities up and down the country. You've also got the national grid,
Yep.
which connects electricity from power stations to every single house in this country. And then you've also got the water network, all the pipes that have been laid to take away sewage and give water to different houses. That and the reservoirs, sorry, that you mentioned the reservoirs as well, very important part of the water network. And I feel like those are infrastructure items that you should build once, you should build well, and then you should maintain.
Yeah.
And expand when you've got additional houses and villages and stuff going up.
And of course, if these are nationwide infrastructures, there's also an argument to be made that it makes sense for them to be a single entity running them, because there's savings to be made. Train tracks are train tracks.
Okay.
Yep, we use the same train track and the same gauge throughout the whole country.
Throughout most of the world, yeah.
Yeah. If you are replacing a train track, it costs you less when you buy more.
Right. Okay.
So therefore, by having a national entity, i.e. one people maintaining all the railways, then they're maintaining larger amounts, so they're going to be buying by more, so everything reduces in cost.
So I feel I feel like my job today is to find the capitalist in you. So I'm going to try and push you to see where you say, oh, fair enough, you can make a profit there. So bear with me.
We're within the realms of infrastructure. I wish you luck.
I'm going to be poking at you for the rest of the show. Okay, so I think infrastructure, 100%. We're completely agreed. And I think Vessel's making the point Mike, I think, is agreed as well. Mike says the privatisation of rail was corrupt to start with. The train operating companies are guaranteed a profit by the government. That doesn't sound like a capitalist enterprise where you're guaranteed profits.
It's almost against the whole idea of free market, isn't it?
And what's the saying that people say? They say it's this capitalism for the workers and socialism for the businesses. For the rich. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so infrastructure, we're agreed. I think everybody says infrastructure. And that's interesting because, and I'd love to see if we've got any listeners who disagree with that, because for me, there's no argument to be made the other side. There's no argument whatsoever.
I'd like to hear one.
Yeah, if there's a company called the National Grid and they own all the pylons and all the wiring and they manage all of those to make sure electricity gets to everyone, and electricity is a basic human need in this country, then it makes zero sense for anybody else to create pylons alongside them and double up the amount of cableage that we use. So if you're only ever going to have one, that's a monopoly, which means the National Grid can charge whatever they want to allow electricity to pass through their cables and make any kind of profit they want unless they run for the good of the nation. So I think that's a political risk, and it's a risk of supernormal profits, which is uneconomic. You know, it's against the ethos of economics, where companies shouldn't be allowed to make supernormal profits. So they need to be run, and they need to make a profit or a surplus. They need to be run. Maybe I can understand people wanting to run it at a cost. But if there comes a situation where people are not going to get their electricity, then there needs to be some kind of subsidy to stop people going without electricity.
Yes.
So infrastructure, I think we're all agreed.
Yeah.
Festa says, what about the company that makes the track using the raw material? I don't see a problem with that company making a profit.
Neither do I. But what I would say is this: if it is a company that's making track and the single customer ends up being, say, UK Rail, then there's certainly an argument then for British government to have a look at nationalising that.
Again, devil's advocate, because on this one, and I think Faz love the question, because I have to think about where I sit on this. This one, the counter argument is, if you're making track at £150 a metre,
sure,
and you've got a contract with the government, and I make the track as good as you, as efficiently as you, have got as many safety standards in place as you have, I've got the right skill set, and I can make it at £125 per metre, then I can go to the government and try and procure that contract. And then that puts you at risk. And then a third person coming at 100. So there is a natural market for people coming in to make track.
If it becomes competitive,
If it becomes competitive, right. Yeah. So this is another thing that I'm sure we could maybe have a whole show on, and that is the allocation of government contracts, the whole procurement process, because that's incredibly corrupt. You know, we've got PPE in the news all the last 2 weeks, and was it Baroness Moan, who's
with her new yacht?
With her new yacht, exactly.
The taxpayer
so plenty to talk about. Listen, Can you believe we're about to go into a break? We've only got a minute.
Already.
But let me just recap what we've talked about. So we've talked about the water industry, the the energy industry generally, the railways, specialist engineering firms that deal in defence, like Rolls-Royce and British Aerospace as well, another company, and communications. I think we've got universal agreement that the infrastructure should be nationalised. But there's probably a little bit of discussion that needs to be had on people servicing that. And one thing that does link to that, and I think you mentioned it on one of the group chats that we're on, was the shortage of antibiotics feeding into the National Health Service.
Yeah.
And that links back to a certain Jeremy Corbyn suggesting that we make...
Have we mentioned him again this week?
Every single week, mate, every single week. So, listen, plenty to talk about. We're going to go off to a short break. We'll be back in about 4 minutes. Thank you so much for your comments. And please continue to interact with the show. Speak to you soon.
You're listening to Salam Radio, and it's now time for Isha Azan. This Azan is sponsored by Park Foods. Come and see the difference.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته. اللهم آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم بك نحيا وبك نموت وإليك المصير. رضينا بالله ربا وبالإسلام دينا وبمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم نبيا ورسولا.
If you have an idea for a show and want to get involved, email info@salamradio.co.uk.
Assalamu alaikum, and we're back for the second half of the show on Why Politics Matters, Salam Radio 106.2 FM. We'd love to get a caller in, so if anybody's got any views they want to share on air, please do call 01733 602 133. That's 602 133. Really interesting conversation, and I know this was going to be a pretty loaded topic, Alex, but you've been surprised as well as I have in terms of the type of discussion we've had, particularly from our Facebook commenters, and also where it's gone down.
It's nice to have some of the other suggestions, and I've got to say, Faisal's come up with another good one here, where he actually feels that there's an argument for all basic needs of everybody being met through nationalised industry, including food, clothing, internet, and education.
Okay.
And I've got to say, I agree with him. I think the clothing's an interesting one, isn't it?
Just before you go into the clothing one, what about the food one?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Certainly, a basic level. Of course, we don't want to be providing people with caviar, or wouldn't be expecting to.
Okay.
But to supply...
Only in the House of Commons dining room, where it's heavily subsidised. But go on, different show. Sorry,
I think it already is, isn't it? But certainly, these basic... the basic resource to survive. I would. But
tell me about the clothing. Then go on. What do you think about the clothing?
Well, I'll say what I said to you at the break, and it does make a very interesting. I mean, and just putting it as devil's advocate and trying to play this a little bit more philosophically, we don't normally legislate for things which we cannot make the resources readily available for people. So I would just ask, do we think it's actually fair to make it law that you must be clothed, but then not supply people the means to be clothed?
So you're saying the government will put you in jail if you walk around naked?
They will. Yeah, and this is Faisal. You've started this one off.
Yeah, and rightly so.
Yep.
We don't want to be seeing you in your birthday suit
Absolutely.
in town.
And I don't necessarily want to be doing it unless it's a very warm day.
But then, if you absolutely have to be clothed, then you're saying the government almost automatically has got the responsibility to clothe you to an extent, to a basic level.
Would it be fair for the government? I mean, I can't think of any reason, but let's say there was an actual benefit to society for every single person flying a kite every morning.
Okay,
but every person doesn't have a kite.
Yeah.
So would it be up to the government, therefore, to provide this kite?
Either yes, it would, or no, because you could treat it as a form of taxation.
Go on.
So the government says everybody's got a responsibility to pay for defence, and defence accounts for, I don't know what it is, 4 or 5% of GDP, whatever.
Sure,
it's billions.
Yeah.
And how do we pay for it? We pay for it, don't we? We pay for it through tax.
The nationalisation, really, though, isn't it? Is that not how the health services and the NHS is funded?
So maybe they're saying, rather than us taking your tax money and providing you with clothing, we're reducing the amount of tax that we pay. So we're leaving the taxation level where it is
to allow you
to go out and buy your clothes.
Okay.
It's an interesting one. I do get your point.
Yeah.
But that kind of takes me on to something slightly different, which you're going to love.
Okay.
Universal basic income.
Yeah, I'm a big fan.
Yeah, so am I. Yeah. And this links to what Faisal's saying as well about, look, everybody should be given food, clothing, education, healthcare, all these things, right?
Yeah.
So you can argue everybody does get education and healthcare. We have the NHS,
sure.
We have education.
These things which are already nationalised and the infrastructure is there and providing for it. But what universal basic income would be is a calculated amount given to everybody each week or each month that is designed to meet these other needs, such as food, clothing, water, heating, energy and transport.
Yeah. So that's almost taking away from the show, in that we're talking about nationalisation versus privatisation. But if UBI, Universal Basic Income, came in, then people could still go out and spend. And the question would still be, would they be spending with a government provider or would they be spending with a private provider? Because that's the distinction, isn't it, between privatisation and nationalisation.
Yes.
And UBI, I think, is a standalone idea that doesn't necessarily have to link in with nationalisation.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just going back on Faisal's point, then the government should provide food, I think it should. Clothing, I think it should. Shelter in the form of housing, I think it should. Education and healthcare. And I think he meant energy as well.
Yeah.
And communications.
Or if not provide them, then provide a means for them to be obtained.
In fact, Jonathan's made the same point. Jonathan said, Jonathan Orchard, thank you for your comment. He said UBI would cover personal needs like food and clothing. Again, there's an argument that there is a universal basic income for those who need it in the form of universal credits, any kind of income support that you get, any kind of benefits you get. Are those benefits not designed to make sure that people don't starve? So, it's not universal basic income because it's not universal, obviously.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm a big proponent of UBI. I think it needs to be universal because it takes away the stigma and everybody gets it, and it's set at a level where you could do a calculation of what your basic needs are and do it set at that level.
And it can be regionalised as well, can't it?
Oh, Councillor Day's on again. Councillor Day.
Good evening, Nicola.
I don't think Councillor Day's made a comment without mentioning the Green Party. I think we should ban her from making comments unless she agrees to stop putting Green Party policy as well. But look, if it is Green Party policy, then it is Green Party policy. And she says universal basic income is Green Party policy. We also want to see energy, water, railway brought into public ownership. That sounds very lefty to me.
I would argue and say that the Green Party are currently far more left than the Labour Party.
Oh, we've had that argument before, and,
Yeah.
and I don't think you had any dispute from me or anybody else on the calls. So really interesting. Thank you for that, Nicola. And certainly Nicola's probably listening to my politics thinking,
why aren't you in the Green Party?
Exactly. No, we share politics. We do share politics. Okay, so let's go back. There was a comment again from Faisal around education, and he said it should be nationalised, and it is. We do have schools we'd have to pay for. That's great. We have to pay for through our taxation rather than individually, so that's great. But he said there should also be the choice for people to send their children to be privately educated. I'm not feeling that. I don't know how you feel about that.
I'm totally against it.
Okay.
My argument would be that what it actually does is create a two-tier education system, whereby those with more money are actually being given more social capital, not a better education.
Yes. So there's no dispute that you could go to a decent performing secondary school comprehensive, and you check the A-level results, and the top 30 percentile, let's say, will score as well as the top 30 percentile in a fee-paying school.
Yeah.
So academically, there's no difference, but it's this social connection that you mentioned.
Yeah, the networking and the cultural and the social capital that's obtained. Yeah. I mean, and you only have to have a look at how many of our prime ministers have all come from the same university.
Yep.
Now, the grades that the people that are getting in this university are not many percentiles higher than every other university in the land.
Oh, you never hear that they got like a first in physics.
No.
You'll hear that they got a degree from Oxford.
Exactly.
And that basically means they studied, okay, no disrespect to the historians, but they might have studied a degree in history and just about barely scraped through with a third from a top university, but connected with the right people at the time.
Yeah.
Got their Oxford degree in a frame, and obviously made those social connections throughout their lives, and gone on to become prime minister.
And I would argue that all that does is it perpetuates the narrative that just by going to these places you are somehow better than somebody that went to a public school, that you're somehow more suited to this life of governance. That's the life. That's the network that brought us Boris Johnson. And if you have a look at his school antics, everybody who went to school with him said he was an absolute failure at school.
Oh, I mean, look at David Cameron and some of the stories that we can't even mention on the radio about what he was doing with the carcass of a pig.
Of swine.
Exactly. Okay, so I agree with you. Social connections. What about healthcare?
You're not going to hear any arguments here. In fact, I would go even further and say that pharmaceutical companies...
I've just had an injury.
Right.
I've just had a ruptured Achilles, and I had to wait 4 weeks after my boot came off before I had physiotherapy. Now,
Okay.
if I went private, I could have seen someone the very next day.
You could have.
Yeah, I could have seen someone weekly. I could have had one-to-one treatments. I could have been shown all the care and attention that I needed. I could have been given a bespoke, very, very specific recovery plan. But instead, NHS, I get to see this one guy for about 10 minutes every 3 weeks, and wait for my one-to-one referral, which happens in 6 weeks, which I finally got. I am seeing somebody next week. But there is an argument there. Like, I want a better standard of healthcare.
And that's fine if you can
I'm playing devil's advocate, by the way, just before you hate me. Go on. I want a better standard of care.
Okay, and that's fine. There's certainly an argument for you there to go and get it, but that's not something that's against the NHS. Now, the NHS, what you described before, is a beautiful system that allows anybody, regardless of whether they can afford that better standard of care that you've described, that free at point of entry care. You know, now if we have a look at what's happened since private industry has come in,
okay,
we've seen a decline in NHS service.
Wait, so you're saying the argument against private healthcare is that socialized healthcare gets worse?
For me, I would say, yeah, it does, yeah.
All right.
Because so all the doctors that are working in private healthcare, where did they obtain their qualifications and where did they obtain the funding for it?
Oh, fair play. Good question. Their parents paid for a private education. £15,000.
In a lot of the places, though, they went on and they got graduates through student finance.
Okay, and
which all the people of the UK helped to subsidise,
which they have to pay back
eventually.
And some of them relied on their parents to pay their way through university. £20,000 a year. They paid 5 years worth. They paid £100,000 and showed incredible. Look. I've got to ask you the questions. The question is this, and let's hone in because we're playing games. Right, we're playing games. Let's hone in. Faisal Mahmood says, "I agree with socialised healthcare, right? But I respect people's right to access private healthcare.
Yeah.
I agree with socialised education, but I respect people's right to choose private education."
And all I would say is this.
What's the key argument against it?
Okay, so in a society, if you have the option of somebody being able to make lots of money or not make lots of money, 9 times out of 10, unfortunately, in a capitalist society, they will choose the option that says make lots of money.
Yes.
Yeah. So in other words, if you have so let's bring that back into the argument that we're discussing here about private healthcare. If you have a doctor who's being given the option of being able to be offered the wages which the NHS can offer him,
sure,
against the wages which private healthcare can offer him, he's going to spend his time with private healthcare sometimes, which therefore means that the hours spent in a GP surgery looking at his consultancy or his normal patients, he cuts down on in order to earn more money in the private healthcare. Lose people from that. So we lose that resource as well. And then that goes in as far as the services that are being offered. Now, what we've seen since private healthcare companies have offered these queue jumping operations, which there was a whole magnitude, and all these services were offered on the NHS.
My nan can't get a hip operation for 9 months. Go down to private healthcare and she'll get it in 2 weeks.
Yeah, so therefore there's less of an argument already within society to invest in the NHS.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think the more people start moving over to private healthcare, even if for, like I said, small things like physiotherapy, onto bigger things like knee operations or whatever it is, or even
these choice and selective surgeries primarily it starts with.
All it does is, and the shame is that people are more affluent and more likely to access these services.
Of course,
the people that are more affluent are more likely to vote.
Yep.
The people who are more likely to vote get a government that represents them, and the more people that start accessing private healthcare and private education, they're more likely to underfund socialized medicine.
So it becomes self-perpetuating.
It becomes, and there must be a tipping point, and we must be getting close to it, because look, I've seen this, I'm sure I've mentioned this before to you, a film by Michael Moore called Sicko.
I think you did mention
Sicko,
it, yeah.
So this is a film about people who, not even people who don't have medical insurance in America. There's about, I think 25% of Americans aren't insured at all, so they can't access it without paying thousands and thousands of dollars. This is about people who are underinsured, so they think they've got insurance, but then they come across this obstacle where something's excluded, so they can't get the treatment they want, and that was sickening to me, because I don't even have to think about that. If I've got a problem, I ring 101. Is it 111? Sorry, I ring 111, or I go in to see my GP, or go into A&E. And nobody's going to ask me to fill in any forms, and I get treated with whatever I have. I don't have to find policy documents. I don't have to find exclusions of coverage and level of coverage and all that kind of stuff. So if we do go down that road, it will be awful. It will be really, really bad. And I think, we've got, in response to Faisal's question, I think we've got to fight that at every opportunity, because the more popular private education and private healthcare get, the less funding will be pushed towards socialized medicine and socialized education.
And that same argument actually could be brought forward to education as well.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Because as long as the rich people who are more affluent people who are more likely to vote are able to make the choice and select better education, they're not going to vote for better education for the working and the lower classes.
Okay.
Or invest in it.
So look, there's a lot of comments, especially this one around, you'll like this one. Universal basic income will be a necessity if we continue heading towards more automation, use of artificial intelligence, which will mean less people are needed for the jobs that they're currently doing. That, I think, is a show in itself. I'd love to give you my views on that, because I've got a lot of thoughts on that. But let's just go back to privatization versus nationalization. So we're all agreed on infrastructure. I think we've made a case that there could be competition for things that feed into the infrastructure. So the production of railroads and the fact that, and then we talked about potential corruption in procurement.
Likewise with the NHS. So for the supply of goods, we don't want the NHS, for example, making bandages.
Mm-hmm.
So the supply of resources within these industry, of course, is going to be market competition.
Yeah. So a certain Jeremy Corbyn said that we need to have a nationalised pharmaceuticals company.
Yeah.
And a lot of people laughed because this was just before the election in 2019. I actually looked into it. I thought deeply about the problem, and I thought, what is the issue? And the issue is we have privatized pharmaceutical companies. The two big ones are GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca here in the UK.
Right.
As others as well, Pfizer, another worldwide provider. There's a number of them. But these companies, they've got something called patents.
Yeah.
So when they develop a drug, they get the ability to exclusively sell that drug for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is, which means they could invest £50 million or £100 million in the development of a drug. That drug is absolutely vital into saving people's lives. People who've got, I don't know, something like, let's just say cancer. Let's just say they find a cancer-defeating drug and they get a 20-year patent on it. They could put a price on your life for 20 years. If you look at the number of people that suffer from cancer, they'll be charging the Nationalised Health Service, the National Health Service, the NHS, anything they want, and the NHS will pay anything that's being asked for 20 years without any recourse. And this company might have invested 100 million in development, drug development, but make 100 billion over the next 20 years in selling the drug before the patent is open to the public. So, infrastructure, we said, it made sense for us to nationalise. Privatising the support network, it only works to an extent, doesn't it? It only works to an extent where there's no protectionism in the industry that's providing to the infrastructure. So there's no protectionism in the development of the railroads. So anybody can create railway lines. But there's a lot of protectionism in drug development.
Sure, yeah.
So
it's almost like maybe the argument needs to be around the level of necessity around these things.
Right, yeah. So basic human need, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's life or death.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and obviously I know that taking medicine isn't what we class as a basic human need, so to speak. And what you were talking there is about, medicines that we haven't even developed.
Mm-hmm. But again, in this film, Sicko, people were buying insulin shots, and a week's worth of insulin shots were costing them $150.
Yeah.
Whereas producing that medicine costs like $10, $5.
Not even. They're talking pennies, aren't they, for insulin? That we're talking thousands and thousands of a percentage in increase.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, people do need it to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting point. Listen, we've got so much that we could say, but I just want to give credit where credit's due, and that's to our listeners and our contributors on Facebook. Mike Kennard's made another really good point, talking about private healthcare. He says the other way of looking at it is because we lose doctors and nurses to private healthcare, we end up filling the NHS with doctors and nurses from other health services from around the world, from countries like India and the Philippines. And I think this point really exacerbates the healthcare problem in those countries, because if you're in a developing country, your health service is still developing.
Yep.
and you're going out of your way to really put some investment into training your doctors and your nurses, because you need that for a healthy society, and you're playing catch up. But the moment you've got your doctors and your nurses qualified, they get a job offer from the United States or from the UK or from Germany or from France. So these developing nations are always going to be playing catch up, and they're losing not just any old nurses and doctors, they're losing their best.
Yeah.
Because we only take the best, right?
Yeah,
We'll only take we'll have an interview process, and there'll be like 5 Indian doctors, and we'll take the best of the 5. And the other 4 we won't take, or we'll take 2 of the 5, and the other 3 won't take. So I think that's a really good point. Your thoughts on that?
It sounds like colonialism under consumerism, doesn't it? Effectively, what we're doing is we're still keeping this stranglehold on these developing countries because our needs are more important to them, and because we have a resource that we can offer.
You've in this show, genuinely, you've said 3 or 4 things over the last few weeks that have blown my mind. What you've just said there has blown my mind completely, and it's an inspirational thing to hear, but at the same time, it's devastatingly depressing, isn't it?
God, isn't it?
Because colonialism via recruitment, essentially, we're taking people's best, and we're profiting from them. Of course, we are, and at the same time, we're enslaving the countries from which we have. So, where migration sounds like we're doing people a favor, actually, we're extracting the best of the best from other countries.
Yeah, and leaving them worse off than we found them yet again.
That's profound. Genuinely, that's profound. Mike said one other thing, which I want to read out. He said, a lot of the basic research is carried out in public universities. He's talking about drug development there, I think. And this is a conversation I've had with a friend of mine, Muncha.
Maybe he meant UBI, actually.
No, he's saying basic research.
Sorry, yeah, okay.
Basic research is carried out in public universities. So Muncha, what Muncha always says is every knowledge that you build is built on previous knowledge. Right?
Dialectic materialism, Marx
exactly.
would build on, yeah.
So why should certain people be allowed to have almost intellectual property rights or patents on knowledge when they've only developed that knowledge off the back of other knowledge?
I'd agree again.
Yeah, and that I think is really powerful, because that basically leads you to a world where there's no patents.
Yep.
Patents, how you want to pronounce it.
And a free sharing of knowledge.
And a free sharing of knowledge.
Which can only advance us further, surely.
Yeah, and what this is, and what people are doing is they're putting shackles on the advancement, so as to prioritize profit.
So in fact, holding back all society, and maybe even ourselves as a species, just to benefit their own personal intrinsic needs there and then.
Yeah, absolutely. I did maths at university, and one of the things I studied was Fermat's last theorem. I don't know if you've heard of it. There's a guy named Pierre de Fermat, very famous mathematician,
right?
And he wrote a theorem. I think it was A to the n plus B to the n equals C to the n for n equals 0, 1, and 2, and nothing else. And then he didn't write the proof, and then lots and lots of people were writing the proof for years, trying to prove it. Couldn't prove it until it got proven, I think, in the 1980s, 1990s, about 130 years after he first wrote it. And the proof of that theorem relied on ancient Chinese mathematical methods, Greek mathematical methods, and then more recent mathematical methods that originated. And it's like,
right,
either Pierre de Fermat never had a solution, or he had a solution, but it was such a phenomenal thing, and he gets recognition for it. But it was built off the back of work that's happened over the last 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years.
Across cultures and hemispheres as
exactly,
well.
Yeah. So if that's not an argument for sharing a knowledge, then what is?
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
That links us back to, and I know this is going to be controversial, that links us back to, Mike, I see you've written a comment. I'll read that just before we go off air. We've only got a couple of minutes. That links us back to supporting Rolls-Royce in their building of engines used in fighter jets. And
how so?
In that, if that is universal information,
right,
or for example, the building of a nuclear bomb, if that is universal information, if that's available to everyone, if that's printed on the internet, then there's got to be some kind of security issues, right? Or do you envisage a world without borders?
Well, I mean, we're going into a whole can of worms here. I mean, personally, yes, I do envisage a world without borders, yes. And that would actually take away a lot of the issues that we have based on borders.
Yeah.
Why would you need the bomb?
Yeah, Yeah, exactly that.
It would make more sense to use that technology for energy.
I'm just going to read out Mike's final comments. Sorry, Nicola and Faisal, I won't be able to read anymore because we're almost out of time. Mike says, what about those sectors which are controlled by cartels and monopolies? So banks, for example. Oh, where's it gone?
Yeah, banks, the National Gyro Bank. And again, it's certainly stuff I would argue that does need to be brought back into the public sector, where we can have some decision on how it's controlled, how it's managed, and how it's policed. I mean, we're the money laundering capital of the world here in the UK, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
And that wouldn't happen if it was publicly owned.
Absolutely. We're all out of time, guys. Thanks to Jonathan, Mike, Faisal, and Councillor Nicola Day for your contributions. It's been really interesting to hear what you've said.
We'll be back in 3 weeks now.
We'll be back in 3 weeks, but I just wanted to say it does feel a bit like an echo chamber, and we really need dissenting voices. So if anybody can think of anyone that has a different view on nationalisation versus privatisation, we'd love to get them on.
Please invite your right-wing friends.
Yes, please. Or your mum. Alex Burr, Imtiaz Ali, thank you so much.